Welcome, everyone. And we're excited for this PD session this afternoon. Just a couple of reminders, just housekeeping things. If you'll remember to just mute your microphones when you're not speaking, that will help eliminate background noise. Please feel free to have your cameras on. We'd love to see who's with us today. We're excited to have Kathryn with us. She's one of our faculty fellows, and really excited to get Kathryn to be offering some more PD, especially when it comes to some of the pedagogy of teaching and learning. And today is focused specifically on developing assessments. And so I'm going to turn it over to you, Kathryn, and thank you for being here and doing this. And the floor is yours.
Okay, great. Thank you, Rachel. And hello, everybody. I think that I know most of you, but if we haven't met, my name is Kathryn Hix. I am one of the faculty fellows here at the college, and I teach generally in the English and humanities programs or departments. And I work a lot with curriculum development and learning outcomes and assessment and those kinds of things as well. And so that's kind of where this workshop is coming from. There's been some interest in talking about assessments, both formative and summative, as well as how to link those testing items into the learning outcomes for your different courses and programs and that kind of thing. And so the session today is going to go through some of that. It's a lot of information. I will say, I know we're scheduled for 30 minutes and we are recording it. So if we need to go back through and watch it again to catch everything, that's great. If you have questions as we go through, feel free to use the raised hand. I can see a few of you in the corner of my screen, so you can like physically raise your hand or just use the little raise hand reaction, or just turn on your mic and interrupt me. I'm happy to address any questions or concerns as we go through this, and I'll also have an opportunity for questions at the end. So as I just mentioned, just an overview of what to expect and what you'll see this afternoon. We're going to talk about assessing student learning, which means testing for most of us, regardless of our discipline. And I wanted to kind of start with the foundation, which is talking about the different types of assessment, both formative and summative. So I'll spend a few slides just kind of explaining those concepts and laying the groundwork there. And then we'll spend some time talking about how we link different testing questions to outcomes and courses. So as we look at assessments, we have two different ways of assessing students when they're in our classes. The first one is the lower stakes version. That's the formative assessment. And we call it formative because we're kind of building with the students as they go through the class. And we're trying to determine as their professors, what they're learning, how well they're learning it, if there are any gaps in any kind of knowledge that we're trying to offer to them. And so there are some easy ways for us to be able to address that, and also to be able to do some lower stakes grading in the course so that we don't end up with these courses where everything is riding on maybe 2 or 3 major grades, like one paper and a couple tests, or a major project or something like that, so that students can build their confidence, have an opportunity to kind of get a decent foundation as they're going into it, and then work our way up to some of the larger, more costly, if you will, grading type situations. And so formative assessments can look like any of the things listed here. They could be small quizzes in class, any kind of class work. Teaching English, obviously I'm working with a lot of writing. So I love doing just an in-class, like daily writing, just an opportunity for students to reflect at the beginning of class. I usually have them turn it in, but I don't grade it on grammar or really even content, as long as I can tell they actually read whatever articles or essays or stories or whatever I assigned. It's more about the free flow of ideas, kind of getting started, and also giving them an opportunity to think about the work before we jump into a discussion and I start calling names and drawing attention to students, especially for our more reserved students or more introverted students. Having a chance to write it out or talk about it with one other person will give them an opportunity to maybe be more engaged in the class and be willing to speak later on. It can also look like journals, reflective content, especially if you're talking about a seminar style class or some of the higher level concepts that we want to think about and students kind of need time to process. And journals are great because they're just between instructor and student. And so nobody else is seeing that. So students have a little bit more freedom there. It could be things in Blackboard like blogs, wikis, obviously discussion boards as well. Where the point values are not huge, maybe it's 20 or 40 or 50 points, something like that. And then little benchmark assignments like pre and post tests, those kinds of things, assessing students' knowledge as they're coming into the course. And we'll talk about some of these in a little bit more detail as we go through. So the first one of those, of course, is quizzes. And as you think about the quizzes, certainly you're thinking about, how many questions are there? How many points do you want to assign for those? But more strategically than that, also think about when you're going to give the quizzes. So is it at the beginning of class to make sure students get in there on time? Certainly people have employed it that way and it works really well, especially if you're having a problem with students being tardy. Or in the era of doing class virtually, maybe it makes sure they get into the Zoom room or whatever you're using. And there's certainly polling and different tools technology wise that you can use to do some of the same stuff that you might do in person on a piece of paper or something like that. Doing them later in class, especially if you have like a block, like an evening class or a lab or something where you give the students a break because you're going for 3 or 4 hours. And so we might want to give them a 5 or 10 minute break in the middle. But what if students don't come back? I've certainly taught evening classes where that's happened. And so sometimes giving the quizzes after that break is a good way to motivate students to return and get those points. They do add up. We're talking low stakes and maybe they're 10 or 15 points or something like that. But if you miss multiple 10 or 15 point quizzes, that is going to impact your grade as time goes on. So that's also something to think about. And then I made this note here, do you list it in the syllabus? I don't. I like the flexibility. Sometimes I need the quiz, sometimes I don't. And I don't want to marry myself to something at the beginning of the semester because a lot of this formative assessment is going to depend on how things go. Sometimes I've got a class, everybody's got it. We're ready to move on to the deeper concepts later. Sometimes we need to go back and revisit some things more frequently. And so I don't want to be committed to anything low stakes necessarily at the beginning of the semester. And then, of course, you've got some other options too. Do the students take their quizzes on their own? Do they pair up maybe with a partner or something like that? Or if you've got some groups going on, maybe they take the quizzes that way. And there are some conversations there about accountability and those kinds of things that we could get into a little more deeply. I'm not going to go that far today because I want to make sure there's time for some of the other discussion, but just some things to think about there. And then after class, certainly there's the option to do some reflective type quizzes to reinforce some of the concepts that you've covered in class that maybe, we did this on Tuesday. Before they get back on Thursday, they need to go to Blackboard and take a quiz there. And I like that too, because it's a time saver. If we're covering so much material in our courses, and I know so many of you are, even that extra 5 or 10 minutes can really be valuable for a class discussion or for a hands-on activity or something like that. And if we can relegate some of the quiz time to Blackboard, then that might be a good option as well. And then it's right there in front of you too. That's the other thing. If you've set it up in Blackboard, you can see those results right before you walk in class. Make sure, everybody's got the answers. If everybody missed number 5, you can go back and hit that before you move on to the next topic in class. Some other ideas for formative type assessments. I like to use peer editing or peer reviewing. I think that that's really good. It can work with case studies. It can work with essays. It can work with all sorts of formats because I know we're looking at lots of different disciplines and that kind of thing. The biggest caveats I would throw out about that is make sure that you've got a rubric or some designated form that you're having the students fill out. It can't be a free-for-all or we won't get anywhere. And so it's got to have some good structure to it. And the students have got to write more than just yes or no, like not did you identify the thesis, but what do you think the thesis is? And have the students write that sentence and think about for the writer of that paper, if you've got 2 or 3 people in your editing group and they've all identified different things at the thesis, then, we know there's some work to do. And so, so really kind of digging deeper into that, finding out where the support, the details, the examples, those kinds of things are, is really helpful feedback for the writer, the original student on the paper. And it's also good exercise for the other students in the group. Study guides are helpful only if they are truly guides to reading the material and working through it, not just a list of this is what's going to be on the test, but a list that sort of helps students work their way through and answer questions as they go, and perhaps work on those in class with a group or turn them in for a grade in preparation for the test. And then these next 4 things I'm going to go through with a little bit more explanation on the following slides, but just some tried and true, easy to do in class formative assessments. Have students just do a little 1-minute write about something that they've learned. You could use a discussion board or another format to have students submit their own test questions. Exit cards, which we'll talk about, which are little index cards that they can turn in at the end of class, and whiteboards. If you have access to those, they're also really helpful. And then you can also, as a group in the class, have students name the important things that they saw covered and then demonstrate those or explain them, depending on what type of class, whether it's a lab or a lecture style class. So the exit cards can look like regular index cards or post-it notes or whatever works the best, where you have students respond to a question. What's the most important thing you've learned? What's something you'd like to know more about? Where are you struggling, or what's the muddiest point? Something that you're not confident about. So you've got a lot of different options there. And you can also think about whether or not you want names on these. If you want to assign points, if they get 5 points for turning in their exit card before they leave, you probably need their names. If you're not so much interested in that and you're more concerned about the content and making sure that you're covering the material and finding those gaps as an aid to kind of help you in your own teaching, then maybe the names aren't so important. So it would kind of depend on your purpose there and how you want to approach that. Whiteboards are fantastic if you have them, and I'm talking about the little like personal sized whiteboards. We have those in sets, like class size sets, and you can get the little tiny erasers and the markers and all the good stuff, and the students love those. I think they like the little small individual sized equipment that goes along with them. It's sort of novel, I suppose. But the great thing about the whiteboards is if the students are holding them up, it's very easy to look out across a class, no matter how big your room is, and find out if somebody's not participating, right? It's pretty obvious. You can't hide very well if everybody's holding up a whiteboard. So it's really good. I love using them for something like grammar. And this could work really well with like terminology or identifying if you're talking about like an A&P class or something like that, and you just need some quick turnaround on those. You can see really easily, did the students do it correctly? Is this something I need to keep working on, or are we ready to move on to the next phase? And then make sure that you're allowing time for questions, and not just yes, no questions, but something more open-ended, and not necessarily do you have questions, but what questions do you have? And I know that sounds like really digging deep and kind of getting into the weeds a little bit, but the way that we phrase that can really make a difference. If there's the expectation that there's questions, it gives students a little bit more confidence and willingness to ask those questions. I found myself, I used to ask the question as sort of my own crutch, like, does that make sense? That's sort of my go-to thing. Like, I want to see if the faces look puzzled or if the faces look calm. But that's really not the best question, right? I need to say, what questions do you guys have? What isn't making sense to you? Something like that, and change it around a little bit. And we all have our own, kind of go-to responses and that kind of thing. And then give them time, a couple minutes. Silence can be challenging, I guess, as instructors. We don't necessarily love it. but some of our students need a few minutes to process and think about what questions or how to phrase their questions, or even maybe what it is that they don't know or want to look into further. So allowing that time is really helpful as well. And then, of course, our other major type of assessment, and we're going to dig deeper into this when I talk about linking to outcomes, is the summative assessments. And those are the big time things, right? The more weighted type of assessments in terms of they count for a higher percentage on the course average, that kind of thing. So unit tests, midterm exams, final exams, you know, a recital at the end, a capstone project. In my classes, certainly a research paper, or, you know, something that the students have created, like a presentation, but, you know, a deliverable at the end of a particular class. And this is where we're going to look at kind of linking the outcomes and making sure that we're matching those things up. And then as we look at the assessments, you know, how are we helping students get the feedback that they need and make any corrections that they might need to have? So giving them feedback using rubrics to just improve the efficacy of our grading is really important. Certainly, we're going to have to align with whatever the department expectations are and what the standards are there. And then thinking about, you know, is this something on paper that we're handing back to the students? Are we doing it electronically in Blackboard? If so, making sure that students are actually going back and looking at that information. I know that some people in the time of Zoom, and now that we have some more tools available, are doing some grading conferences, you know, like a 10-minute session on a major project or a paper or something like that, where the instructor and the student are just one-on-one talking through it. And I know that may seem a little bit cumbersome, but in the long run, if you're grading an essay that's 6 or 8 pages long, a 10-minute conference is going to be much quicker on our end, and we're going to cover more material than we could ever write in comments and that kind of thing on a piece of paper. So that may be something to consider as well, and just kind of making the tools and the situation that we have in front of us work for us. So I mentioned that we're going to start thinking about, with these larger assessments, especially linking to the course outcomes. And that's a big part of developing the assessments and using them constructively in our courses. And so this probably looks familiar to many of you in terms of the taxonomy. And I know that we have many, many different taxonomies available to us now that are more specific to our disciplines. But I just wanted to use Bloom's here because I think it's familiar to the broadest sector of us. And we can move on from there, and the principles that we talk about with this will apply to whatever other taxonomy that you use or that's most appropriate to your subject matter or that your department prefers, or whatever the case may be. And so obviously here, you know, we're building from the foundation at the bottom of the triangle here, just the base knowledge level all the way up to where students are beginning to compose and create and evaluate and pull ideas together. And so we're going to talk about what types of questions on assessments work for these different levels. So this is my sort of recreation of where our types of questions might fit into a taxonomy. So if we're looking at the very bottom, or the knowledge base, that's going to be our traditional type multiple choice questions, true false questions, pretty much the simpler stuff. And probably what a lot of times what we think of when we're thinking about writing tests. And I'm going to go into some more details about each one of these, but I wanted you to see the full big picture here to begin with. The next level up, getting more into explaining or describing things, is going to be like matching type sets for questions. And then as we get more sophisticated, perhaps fill in the blank, and then further out, even short answer or essay questions, which can vary in length and delivery, and we'll talk about that as well. Okay, so for multiple choice questions, there's a lot here, and there are a lot of things. It's kind of the foundation level, but there's a lot of things to consider as we look at those. And so I've got some notes here, and I've got some really good resources at the end on the final slide that can help us as we develop these later on. But basically for multiple choice, we're assessing the basic knowledge and comprehension. So the beginning level, and what you want to look at as you're kind of matching these up is your outcomes on your syllabi, right? So, what program learning outcomes do you have? What course outcomes do you have? Is this an introductory course? If so, maybe you're going to be more focused here at the early stages of the taxonomy, right? With those multiple choice type questions, maybe some true false, maybe even some further on. If you're in an end class, a seminar style class, a capstone course, those types of things, we're probably going to sway more heavily to projects, essay questions, those types of assessments. So even within the courses, that's going to help us determine what type of questions or what type of content we're going to have on the assessments. So think about the timing for the multiple choice test. Do you want to deliver that for every unit? Maybe you've got it divided out into 4 or 5 units within the semester. Maybe just a midterm and a final exam. That's going to depend on your course structure and your content there. But generally, that's kind of what we think of. And certainly quizzes are probably going to do that too, use multiple choice type questions as a quick click through for some of those minor formative assessments as well. It is possible for multiple choice questions to address more complex content, but those questions become more and more difficult to write. And so we have to spend more time putting those together. And multiple choice questions really can be challenging depending on your topic. Sometimes it's very straightforward. If it's vocabulary or terminology or something like that, that students are just defining things. But if we're looking at more conceptual type ideas, then those questions are going to come more difficult for us as instructors to put together. And just some tips for using multiple choice questions, which is here in the middle of the slide. Be consistent. Use the terminology that you're using in class that's being used in the textbook. Sometimes because we're so familiar with our fields and our areas of interest, we use terms interchangeably that aren't familiar to the students, and that can be cause for confusion, or we understand what the term means, but the students don't understand what the term means, and we make assumptions in those areas. So make sure that you're linking directly to the content you're offering in class, to the terms that are used in the textbook, those kinds of things. And then be consistent with the actual structure of your question. So, if you want there to be 3 choices for each question, great, do that throughout. If it's 5 choices, that's fine, but do it throughout. Don't, have a question where one's got 3 options, the next one's got 4, the next one's got 5, and you waver back and forth between them. And then obviously it goes without saying, we want the correct answer to be different in a different order each time through the test. So there's not any predictability to it. And when you're looking at the research on multiple choice, I just wanted to add this here, that a lot of places and a lot of scholars will call the incorrect answers the distractors. And that's a term that, again, being consistent with the vocabulary, I wanted you to be familiar with if you dig into this further, that you know what those terms mean. And so I added that here as well. When you're writing the questions, the bulk of the content should be in the question for a multiple choice style. And so the answer options for the student should be much shorter. They should be phrases, a few words, something like that, not big long sentences that the students have to wade through to find that correct answer. And going along with that same thing, the answers should be parallel. So if you start the first option with a verb, you should start the rest of them with a verb as well. If it's just a word or a term, then it should just be, one word for each answer option. And then consider how you present the questions as you go through. Blackboard gives us the option to randomize throughout. That might be appropriate, and it's helpful in terms of academic integrity and those kinds of things. But it's more difficult, that goes without saying, for the students. And so is that what you want? Or do you want to follow sort of the chronology or the order in which you presented the material in class? So that's another point to think about there. The next set of questions, and again, this is kind of the foundation level, assessing knowledge and comprehension, are true false questions. And general advice is if you're going to have those, they could be in combination with multiple choice. So you may have a question set of 50 for a midterm exam or something like that. If you combine both styles of questions, generally speaking, we want to include at least 7 to 10 true false questions amongst those multiple choice so that they don't stand out, so that it's not such an abrupt departure or change for the students as they're looking through the questions. The disadvantage of true false questions obviously is that higher guessing factor. It's a 50-50 chance, right? As opposed to if you've got 3 to 5 options for multiple choice, it's a little harder to narrow down. So you've got to weigh that too and consider how important it is for you if true false questions are appropriate there. And one way to get around that is to, especially if you have it in an in-class assessment where it would be easier for students to write on the test, is to allow them to correct false answers. So if something is incorrect, how would they change the statement to make it true? And that ups the complexity for this style of question, and it minimizes that guessing factor. It takes away some of that chance in the questions. Moving up to the next level would be matching style questions. So this is going more towards identifying, classifying, perhaps describing, which works really well for terms. It works well for vocabulary. It also works, like I use it for authors, maybe matching to titles or matching to themes or styles or types of criticism, something like that. So it can work in like categories. And then obviously it can also work for more hands-on type things, like if you're talking about healthcare, where we're identifying parts of a body or a body system, or if we're talking about something more technical and we're looking at a part and we have to identify the different components. Matching works really well with that. We can use images instead of just word sets. So those are the types of things that this would do well for. And one caveat here is to make sure that you're creating themes. So if you've got the phrase and the terminology sets, that they revolve around some sort of unified theme or topic, not that you're mixing up everything from the entire semester. So you may have multiple sets of matching with kind of an overarching concept or idea that you would communicate to the students ahead of that. And then moving up the scale here, fill in the blank is sort of the next level as students learn to solve problems for themselves and interpret the information in a little more sophisticated manner. And here you can choose whether you provide the options for the students or not. Is it just a direct fill in the blank where the students got to come up with the term or the person or the date themselves? Or is it something where you're giving them those opportunities? You may have more than one blank within the same question. That part is fine. What's not as great is if you make compound questions that deal with two different concepts. It's the same way we would say a course outcome needs to address only one thing within that outcome. We don't allow compounds in our learning outcomes, so we wouldn't want compounds here either. Make sure that it's clear and directly linked to a single concept when we're looking at that, so that students can interpret that and determine the answers themselves readily. And then from there, we move into the short answer and essay style questions. And there are similarities between these, certainly depending on what kind of length you determine for your short answer. It might just be a couple sentences to a paragraph, whereas an essay response may be several paragraphs or a full length essay. And of course, we're moving further up the scale of terminology, right? And so here we're looking for students' ability to organize their ideas. Maybe they're comparing and contrasting two different topics, two different concepts, two different arguments, whatever the case may be. So this is probably going to be best suited for broader lengths like units, full course type of concepts, maybe the midterm exam, that kind of thing. Certainly we're reinforcing things that students have learned in other classes, and grammar and mechanics can be addressed in all disciplines. Sometimes we find that professors are relying really heavily on grading the composition part of short answer and essay questions and not as much on the content portion. And you want to make sure that those proportions are adequate for what the goals of your course may be. So yes, certainly we want them to spell correctly and use proper grammar and those kinds of things, but we also really want to look at with these questions how they're addressing the content for this particular course. And we're going to weigh that more heavily, preferably in the grading, which leads into the idea of scoring here, using a rubric so that the expectations are clear and that you can be more objective and consistent going through the different answers, the different responses that you receive in the course. And I would encourage you to release that rubric in advance. I think it's great for a checklist for students as they're preparing for the test or for the assessment, however you're presenting it. It kind of gives them a guidepost to look ahead. That's not just a study guide. And then finally, the essay, which can be included on an exam or a midterm or something like that, or maybe a kind of a standalone project. And this is the student's ability to create and compose and pull ideas together and create their own arguments and their own concepts here in the way that the topics relate to one another and in the way that they're interacting with the subject matter in your course. Make sure that the prompt is specific, that you're providing all of the requirements well ahead of time. Again, consider how you're going to grade, how you're going to allot the points, whether or not you want to require an outline. Do you want the students to go ahead and draft something out ahead of time and then bring that to class to build their essay? Do you want to time it? How are you going to determine whether the students have that information? Is it important that they have to be able to recall it within class, or is it okay for them to work on it outside of class and then bring it together for the final exam? So those are some things to think about. And I know that was a ton of information in 30 minutes. So I do want to allow time for questions, and I know it's 2:37. And so I totally understand if you've got class or something else going on, feel free to pop out if you need to, but I'm also happy to stay here for a few minutes and address questions. And like I said, I've got a slide at the end with some really good resources on it as well for you to refer back to. So I'll open the floor for everyone.
I was going to say there was a question in the chat box about the little whiteboard sets.
Yeah.
Oh, okay. I didn't see that. Let me see if I can.
All right. It's kind of vague in the chat because I think I typed it as it was happening, but you had mentioned these little whiteboards as a set, and where do we find those?
Well, I was going to show you. Let me see. I'm going to pull this out from under my desk really quickly to show you what it looks like, and then we will find out. This is what they look like. That's why I say they're pretty conspicuous. So students are not going to be able to hide behind these in class, and they work really well. I got these from our department. I think some departments have sort of a number of class sets that are available. You're welcome to borrow mine anytime. I've certainly loaned them out to people across campus. As long as they make their way back to me, I'm fine with that. So I'm happy to let you borrow mine if you have an occasion to use them. But yeah, I would check in with your department too and see if they have them. Sometimes people have them and they're not even aware that they have access to them.
Great, thank you. Yeah, I've used the, what are the other kind? Mine.
There's,
but they're wasteful because I like the
like the big sticky notes.
Yes, those.
Those are great though. They're expensive, but they're really cool. I like them too because they're easy to move around and stick on the walls and all that stuff. Yeah.
Oh, those big Post-it notes.
They're fun. Other questions?
I didn't have any questions. I just had some takeaways from it that just made sense as far as how to organize the test and, just kind of sequencing the test and maybe in a good order and how you taught it and using the same type of terminology and just different ways on, being consistent with the number of options per question, keeping that consistent. Like throughout the test. And I think the key thing was the rubric, you know, when the students are doing like an essay or some type of short answer, maybe having a rubric for something like that, more of a guide. I normally have found I've been using rubrics for more like a bigger projects, like a research project, but hadn't quite thought about putting one together for some of the little smaller little things. So, so I didn't have any questions, just some things I've made notes of.
Great. Yeah, I hope it was helpful.
Yes, thank you very much. It's one of the things that I have found is sometimes you've been teaching for quite a while, and it's good to get some refreshers to get the juices flowing again.
Absolutely. And sometimes it's the foundational things that we forget about. You know, we get so deep into the content that we forget some of the practical stuff that just makes sense, but our brains have moved on, you know?
Yeah, I agree. And I guess I do have one question for the faculty fellows. I know you put out the little articles like once a month, the little newsletters I meant, and but I hadn't quite got a grasp of if I needed like one of you to assist a particular faculty member, let's say as far, I'm assuming since you've done this PD that you guys could assist with the test, and maybe, I don't know, with like organization and how they have their layout in Blackboard. Would that be something that you and Lee would do for a faculty member? Like
we work mostly with the curriculum part of it. So, you know, setting up the outcomes at the beginning. Certainly we could talk about some testing in terms of just kind of thematic and organizational stuff. And then as far as Blackboard goes and setting up a consistent look and feel there, that would be the people in the CISC. Yeah.
Okay.
And they're great about that.
Okay, good. Yeah, just kind of wrapping my mind around who does what.
It's a lot of options.
Yeah. Well, thank you.
Yeah, thank you. I'm glad you were here.
I do have a quick stupid question, and if not, maybe Rachel can include it on my little list that I sent her. But you had mentioned the Blackboard inline grading, and I love that. I use that on a regular basis. I come from a different institution, so ours was a little more user friendly, I think. The text one annoys me to no end because it starts out at 18 font in black ink. And why I would type black large when I'm trying to maybe use blue or something that would be distinguishable and I need to fit it on a certain way, I'm constantly going in and changing that. Is there a way to default that so that you're not changing it on every stinking assignment and every student?
Not that I know of, although I would love to know. Yes, because I have the same problem, because when you do that, then it writes over what you're trying to correct, which is also problematic. So yeah, you've got to fix it and reformat it. But yeah, the Blackboard grading tools have changed a bit in the last, 18 months or so, I guess. And some things have been a little bit more user-friendly, but I agree that that text tool is not ideal. But I don't know of a workaround for it yet.
Okay.
Unfortunately.
And I'll add that to the list. My guess is the person who would know for sure is Lee McMinn.
Thank you.
All right, I'm going to show the references slide just here for the end, just to make sure that it's in the recording, because like I said, I think that some of these are really good and really helpful. And there's a couple specific to multiple choice, which I included at the bottom in their own category. Some of them are nicely bulleted out so that you can, kind of quickly pick up some things. I want to say this first one in the multiple choice question is written as an article, which is really helpful, but you've got to read the whole thing. It's not something just quick access. But these are really good. And this is an entire like document, like almost like a workbook kind of thing, which is an excellent resource too, if you have time as you're preparing for future classes or future semesters or whatever the case may be. It's a really good kind of guidebook to working on some of this. And it takes time. We're always kind of tweaking and improving and changing around the way that we order our tests, create our assignments, all of those kinds of things. And so certainly we're all always going to be changing them, but it just kind of, I think as Nancy mentioned, it's nice to kind of go back to the basics and remember why we're doing it and kind of how and some best practices for this.